Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout South Africa and their connections to land, water, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people listening today. Much of your work has focused on decolonizing mental health practice in those communities. What brought you to this interest in decoloniality?
So I never explicitly identified myself as a decolonial activist. Rather, I saw myself as an anti-apartheid activist who examined race, class, and gender as sites of struggle through a critical lens. In that same spirit, I approach mental health through both a decolonial and critical framework, recognizing the enduring effects of structural oppression, systemic oppression, and seeking to dismantle barriers to healing. My interest in decoloniality within mental health practice stems from a deep awareness of how social injustices, systemic inequalities, and Western-centric frameworks have shaped mental health care in low and middle-income communities. I came to realize that conventional mental health models often fail to acknowledge the lived experiences, cultural strengths, and indigenous knowledge system of the very communities that they aim to serve. Through my work, I have witnessed how colonial legacies continue to manifest in disparities in access. I've noticed the pathologizing of cultural expressions of distress and the dismissal of non-Western healing traditions. This realization fueled my commitment to challenge these structures and advocate for a more inclusive and contextually relevant approach that honors the wisdom of communities and promotes healing beyond the confines of Eurocentric models. Recognizing these injustices fueled my commitment to challenging these structures and advocating for a mental health approach that is truly inclusive, contextually relevant, and rooted in justice. Decolonizing mental health for me is not just about reforming practices. It's about dismantling systemic barriers and restoring agency both to individuals and communities, recognizing their resilience and ensuring that healing is informed by equity, cultural humility, and historical awareness. So one example is the ongoing pathologization of culturally specific expressions of distress, such as communal healing, practices, or spiritual interpretations of trauma, which are often dismissed within Western psychiatric frameworks. This reinforces the idea that only Eurocentric models of mental health are valid, marginalizing indigenous knowledge and healing traditions. Furthermore, economic inequities, such as the link between poverty and mental illness, creates a cycle of distress, where individuals facing financial hardships struggle to access care due to prohibitive costs or the lack of insurance coverage.
So what I'm hearing from you is that South Africa is still greatly feeling the effects of apartheid today. And your work is about dismantling the legacy of that impact on people's mental health. What exactly does this work involve?
So in all aspects of my practice, whether teaching, training, counseling, facilitating, psychoeducational workshops, or conducting screening assessments, I center decolonize and critical mental health principles. My teaching and training challenge dominant Western psychiatric narratives and emphasizing culturally responsive, context-specific approaches that recognize the lived realities of individuals in the communities that I work in. In individual counseling, I create spaces where clients can explore their experiences without the constraints of Eurocentric diagnostic frameworks, validating indigenous and collective healing practices. My psychoeducation workshops aim to dismantle stigma and provide accessible community-driven mental health knowledge, empowering individuals with tools for resilience rooted in their own cultural and context, very specific to their own context. So through screening assessments, and I tend to use a more narrative approach to screen, I prioritize structural and systemic factors influencing distress and ensuring that evaluations do not reinforce oppressive categorizations, but instead advocate for holistic intersectional understandings of mental health. Across all activities, I aim to deconstruct traditional hierarchies, ensuring that healing is collaborative, affirming, and justice-orientated. So in applying a decolonial approach to counseling, it requires intentional strategies that challenge colonial narratives and uplift marginalized voices. I incorporate these principles by trying to create, again, safe spaces and approaches that affirm the lived experiences, identities, and histories of my clients. This includes recognizing power dynamics and making space for their voices. Unfortunately, my space is not physically welcoming for people with physical challenges, and therefore I see very few clients with physical challenges. I try as much as possible to collaborate with traditional healers, religious leaders, and recognize that spiritual and communal practices and needs to be incorporated into culturally relevant treatment planning and coping mechanisms such as storytelling, rituals, or collective care. I make a very concerted effort to be mindful of the language I use and move away from pathologizing language and instead use strength-based narratives and where I reframe mental health challenges in ways that honor resilience, agency, and legacy. I engage in therapeutic approaches that prioritize client storytelling, resistance, and social justice, and support clients in reclaiming their narratives, explore historical trauma, and position themselves within movements for change. In my continuous professional development, I critically assess dominant psychological theories and approaches and recognize their limitations in addressing the complexities of oppression and colonial histories, and try and use methodologies rooted in Afrocentric, indigenous, and other culturally affirming perspectives. My own formal CPD journey focuses on upskilling myself, while my informal CPD involves extensive reading to deepen my understanding of how mental health is intricately linked to economic, political, and social conditions. This knowledge strengthens my commitment to advocacy beyond the therapy room, supporting clients in securing housing, education, employment, and justice. I strive to create a collaborative space where clients feel empowered rather than directed by an external authority. Shared decision-making and validation of their lived experiences are central to my work ethic. To uphold these values, I remain engaged in supervision, individually, in groups, and with peers, allowing me to critically reflect on my own biases, privileges, and the ways in which traditional mental health frameworks may inadvertently perpetuate harm. Thanks, Aurora. I hope that's answered your question.
So your work is much more community oriented than the traditional idea of counseling. Neesha, you and I studied together, and when we reconnected sometime later, you mentioned that through your practice, you had realized the need for a more decolonial approach to mental health in South Africa. How do you feel our training prepared us for working as counsellors, and what led to your shift towards decolonizing mental health?
So, to answer it this way, I do think it's essential that we meet clients where they are both emotionally and culturally, that our training is ongoing, and that it shouldn't just be at some big old workshop where we've paid, a butt ton of money to attend, but it should also be meeting leaders and wise people within these communities and leaning on their knowledge and their deeper understanding of sort of the conflicts that go on, and to really engage and go, how can we meet in the middle and share information to really better this aspect? So our multidisciplinary approach should also be a multicultural one. It should be grounded in the client's context, and also combine some of our understandings of Western psychology principles and philosophy. I believe we have received quite a strong training or practical training at Cornerstone. I think we were quite privileged in the sense that we had the freedom to share our ideas and collaborate with each other and engage meaningfully with our lecturers in a way that they knew our names. We weren't just a number, and we build on these conversations. There was always just such an open dialogue that really enriched my learning experience. And while this training did lay an excellent foundation for us, as I mentioned, that ongoing professional development is so crucial. It feels like the real learning has happened after our training, and that everything was just character building up until that point. So my personal journey towards decolonizing psychology began when I met Shaheeda, because she was a lecturer at SACAP, I believe. And I think she had run courses on decolonizing psychology, and she'd obviously read and studied and researched so much on it. And we had such a deeply engaging, set of conversations that really shifted my thinking. I stopped using language like, yes, we're going to do CBT today. That was the kind of language I stopped using. It shifted to things like, let's work through some of the difficulties that you're facing. How do you feel like you're self-sabotaging today? And that shift has just really improved my counseling overall. Especially when I began exploring this approach further during my work as a locum school counselor. She sort of introduced me to the school and was like, hey, I need to take a bit of a sabbatical. Would you be willing to sort of step in for me? And maybe this could be a great experience for you. And from there, I really had to make use of that decolonizing psychology, because kids are the foundation, they're the main aspect of where we want to offer preventative assistance for other chronic conditions and other mental health challenges. So it really was sort of the start or the seed of something.
Now, in the previous episode, we spoke to Shaheeda about what decolonial counseling looks like in general practice. What does decolonizing mental health mean to you when working with children?
So one key takeaway from our training that I would bring into this response of mine is that there really was an emphasis on moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to working with mental health, especially with children, even more so with adults. So it's essential to recognize and sort of respect that these diverse backgrounds of the children we work with, so using languages and practices that are culturally meaningful, is absolutely essential when we're looking at that aspect of decolonizing psychology. And also to honor those traditional understandings of mental health and distress is so important. For example, one thing that really stuck with me in our training, and it really blew my mind, was that, for example, in Xhosa, there is no direct translation for the word depression. There may be other similar words that could describe on a much different scale that sort of feeling, but that is so important in terms of mental health and having a community that has a language for the challenges that they face in the current time that we're in. So recognizing these linguistic and cultural differences helps create space for children to express their emotions freely, especially when caregivers, elders, and community leaders are involved in the process. So really getting buy-in from parents, from these religious leaders to sort of support their communities because they're working in those spaces and you want to make sure that those resources are as accessible as possible. So gaining parental support or caregiver support especially, and respecting their community-specific values around child rearing is just vital to ensuring that that therapeutic or that safe environment that we want to create is inclusive, it is empowering, and it is genuinely supportive. So we must also remain of how historical trauma can shape children's mental health and behavior. There's actually an amazing study that was done where research was done by this author called Yehuda in 2022 that showed that trauma can leave biological imprints on subsequent generations, many generations after. For example, studies have documented how low cortisol levels in children of Holocaust survivors, and they've replicated this finding among survivors of other large-scale traumatic events, for example, like your 9/11s. So while this might initially suggest a predisposition to mental health vulnerabilities, there's emerging evidence that these epigenetic responses may also serve as adaptive mechanisms to help children navigate these similar hardships. So it's interesting that a lot of what was going on for those parents, as they were getting ready for this wonderful life to be born into this world, there were so many aspects that came into it. You're not just carrying, for example, put it this way, you're not just carrying the trauma of your mother, you're carrying the trauma of your grandmother, your great-grandmother, the stresses that they faced, and those all build in. So having a generation now currently that we're working with and aiming to break those sort of generational difficulties is such big work for us within this field. So it's absolutely such a privilege to work with these groups. And finally, sort of that language and communication, as I mentioned earlier, play a fundamental role. So providing services, for example, in the child's home language, often if the child's first language and they really struggle with English is not, like their home language is not English, I often find it's better to refer on. There are plenty of counselors that can assist, and it's important that we know our network and know who to call as part of our assistance and care. So, and it's also important because you want to be attuned to how behaviors and symptoms in those cultures can be, really spoken to and promoted. So promoting self-awareness and cultural pride and advocating for more inclusive mental health and school-based policies can really help create a supportive foundation where all children and families feel seen, heard, and valued. When I worked at the school, it wasn't just about, seeing the client in the session during the school day for 30 minutes. It was also, WhatsApping and getting parents in and chatting to them and having the conversation. And often, it made them think about their own journey and, seeing, oh, okay, well, this is how we can. So really working together with families and parents and staff is so important. Often you'll find a lot of the difficulties children face. These other supportive structures are also influenced by those things as well.
How can social practice enhance the principles of psychology?
Oh, it can definitely enhance the practice of psychology by integrating community engagement, cultural awareness, and systemic change into therapeutic approaches. By contextualizing mental health, practitioners in this profession can understand how social structures, economic conditions, and historical injustices shape individual and collective well-being. So instead of focusing solely on an individual or individual therapy, social psychology encourages group interventions, peer-supported networks, and culturally relevant healing practices. It creates an opportunity to address social determinants of mental health, such as housing, employment or unemployment, education, discrimination, and the crucial role in psychological well-being, and ensures that these are considered in treatment plans. Mental health practitioners can use social practice to challenge oppressive systems, advocate for mental health accessibility, and support marginalized communities. So by integrating social psychology practices, practitioners can improve communication, behavior change strategies, and group dynamics in counseling. Practitioners can facilitate support groups, workshops, and safe spaces where people can collectively process experiences and build resilience. Counseling can go way beyond the therapy room by engaging with activists, educators, and grassroots organizations to integrate mental health care into broader social movements. Work alongside communities to co-create solutions tailored to their unique needs rather than imposing external psychological models. I strongly believe that if we blend psychology with art, storytelling, spirituality, and activism, we would be able to provide culturally resonant care. We need to support systemic changes that improve access to psychological care for marginalized groups. And we need to empower our clients as agents of change by facilitating a process where they can see their mental health as interconnected with their environment and equip them with tools to navigate both their personal and social struggles.
I love that. Now, South Africa, which Desmond Tutu called the Rainbow Nation, is extremely multicultural. We have 12 official languages, each representing a distinct culture and community, and some of them even have different predominant faiths. Can you talk a bit more about the role of multiculturalism and diverse faith-based practices like community and prayer and their relationship with Western psychology?
So, multiculturalism and diverse faith-based practices indeed play a significant role in shaping psychological well-being, often challenging and expanding traditional Western psychology. Western psychology has historically emphasized individualism, whereas many multicultural and faith-based traditions prioritize communal healing. In many cultures, mental health is seen as interconnected with family, community, and spiritual well-being. Group therapy, shared rituals, and collective support systems can be powerful alternatives to individual therapy. Faith-based practices like prayer, meditation, and spiritual reflection can serve as coping mechanisms, fostering resilience and emotional regulation. While Western psychology often focuses on cognitive and behavioral interventions, integrating spirituality can enhance therapeutic outcomes. And I think today we often call it mindfulness. And a lot of spiritual practices has mindfulness as part of its components. So especially for clients who find meaning and strength in their faith. So many non-Western traditions view mental health holistically, incorporating mind, body, and spirit, the mindfulness aspect that I was talking about. Practices such as yoga, mindfulness, fasting, and traditional healing methods are increasingly recognized in psychology for their benefits in reducing stress and promoting emotional balance. Western psychology has sometimes pathologized spiritual experiences, labeling them as symptoms of mental illness rather than valid expressions of belief or distress. The decolonial approach encourages psychologists to respect and integrate diverse cultural and spiritual perspectives rather than dismiss them. Multicultural and faith-based perspectives push psychology to expand its frameworks, and it incorporates narrative therapy, indigenous healing practices, and interfaith counseling. This ensures therapy is culturally responsive and aligns with clients' worldviews.
Working with trauma is complex and challenging, and there are specific considerations in trauma care when working with children. How do you translate the principles of trauma-informed counselling to child and play counselling?
That is almost a 10-step question or spectrum of looking at things, because there are so many things that go into this mixing pot of how did we get here? And I think everything starts with developmental stages. As you and maybe some of the viewers can look into this, that for each period of life, we have developmental stages. And at these developmental stages, for example, the earliest one that's often something people struggle with late in life is the stage of trust versus mistrust. Predominantly in the early years of your life, within the first few years, your caregivers are mainly how you are learning this attachment style of, can I trust you to take care of me? Will you feed me? Will you offer me safety and security? Often if that's not taken care of in that early stage, it comes out in later stages of life in terms of how we interact with other people. That being said, though, I feel that we often boomerang to different points back. We're constantly in the state of needing to resolve various aspects of these developmental stages until we reach, this amazing point of self-actualizing. And, even then you can bounce up and down between these developmental stages. But the essential part that I want to get across is creating that safety and stability for children. So there's a lot of pushback, I believe, at the moment around rules and routine, but the research has shown that routine and rules, when taken into consideration your child's context, so without going to the extreme, really is meant to create stability. Knowing, for example, that every day, supper's at 8 o'clock, we're in bed by 8:30, creates that certainty. You're less anxious. Whereas a lot of children in South Africa, they don't know when their next meal is, and the impact that it has on them is incredible. So those aspects of safety and having basic human needs cared for and taken care of is such a big aspect. I mentioned attachment and relationships earlier. So, knowing that you could trust your caregiver or your parent in those early stages of life has such big implications for people on their friendships and even romantic relationships, more significantly in terms of how they resolve conflict or how they view conflict or how they look at being with someone. And considering that no man is an island, as the famous expression goes, we need to learn how to be with people and how to be comfortable within ourselves in that same sense. And then another aspect that makes working with trauma complex and challenging is communication barriers. Often, as I mentioned, you may not be able to find someone in your area to, see a child with these language barriers, and you have to find a way to communicate and to offer them assistance. So often I will work with pictures and be like, how do you feel today? It's a sad face or a smiley face, and tell me, what are you feeling? Let's use pictures to communicate. So that's a big aspect. And even with language, some children are quite nonverbal. So they rely on a lot of nonverbal cues as a self-defense mechanism as well, to just prevent, because often if they say something in certain communities and in certain households, they'd get hit or they'd face other forms of abuse and neglect. So working with children in those aspects also requires a certain amount of care. And then I mentioned this earlier, but really involving caregivers, helping them understand what the child's needs are and helping them work towards freedom of expression is a big aspect. And then avoiding re-traumatization is a very, very big one. So often when we're trying to understand something that the child is facing, having them explain something so many times to every other person who has asked them is just it's re-traumatizing them. And so we have to find a different way of addressing issues at times. It's one of the reasons why I like the brainwork recursive therapy, because it works with children and it does in such a way that we don't actually have to re-traumatize our clients. We don't have to ask them to, sort of go and re-explain things. We just ask them to work with that memory and with that feeling, which is great. And then cultural context and sensitivity. I mentioned earlier that having sometimes a culture or a community not having a language around mental health difficulties often means that the expression for those difficulties is quite suppressed or subdued. And so understanding and being creative and finding different ways to engage with them is such an important aspect. And then a lot of the work that we do as registered counsellors is building resilience. And I think you could go about that in almost 101 ways if you really wanted to, but it's such a big aspect to managing any mental health condition, is to really get that step forward. You need to build resilience. So that's such a big factor. And then I would say long-term monitoring. So really making sure that you're following up, whether your client is seeing a GP or is working with a psychiatrist and other mental health practitioners, really following up, checking in every once in a while. Are they fine? Have they developed? Do they need more assistance? And working with your community. So that interdisciplinary collaboration is also quite important.
Over the past few decades, there has been a rise in Islamophobia worldwide. South Africa has quite a large Muslim population, especially here in the Western Cape, and you do a lot of work with Muslim clients. How has this global climate of Islamophobia filtered through to South Africa, and how does it impact the local Muslim population?
So Islamophobia has manifested in South Africa in various ways, and it has been influenced by global narratives and local socio-political dynamics. So while South Africa has a history of religious tolerance, incidents of anti-Muslim sentiment have surfaced, particularly in the form of hate crimes, discrimination, and negative media portrayals. So I'll just say a little bit on how I believe Islamophobia has infiltrated the South African landscape. So Islamophobic rhetoric from Western countries has shaped the perceptions of Muslims in South Africa, often linking Islam to extremism. Online platforms have amplified Islamophobic narratives, sometimes leading to real-world hostility. There have been incidents of vandalization or vandalism and desecration of mosques, hate crimes, attacks in Cape Town where mosques were defiled with pig blood. And these are just some examples. And some political and religious discussions have framed Muslim communities as security threats, which reinforces stereotypes. So what has the impact of this been on Muslims? It's created a climate of fear and exclusion, affecting the sense of belonging among South African Muslims. However, at the same time, we do see people from the Muslim community taking the lead in issues of social justice as a way of reclaiming themselves, reclaiming their place in this land, the country of their birth. This sense of freedom did not exist with the apartheid movement. The Muslim community has had to navigate theological debates and increased scrutiny, particularly in public spaces. I'm not sure if other religions have been subjected to the same kind of scrutiny and treatment in South Africa. Muslim leaders and organizations have actively worked to counter Islamophobia, promoting interfaith dialogue and unity. This is the same as asking people of color to work harder to prove that they are not dangerous. Now, despite these challenges, South Africa's Muslim population continue to play a vital role in politics, academia, and social justice movements, advocating for religious coexistence and equity. So I have some ideas on how to address it, and if I could go ahead and share that now. So to address Islamophobia in South Africa requires strategic activism, policy reform, and community engagement. Some ways it can be done is to be part of interfaith dialogues to build understanding between different religious communities, to include in our CPD training dedicated spaces, to issue all forms of homophobia, and to discuss issues of race, class, religious differences, Islamophobia, and other forms of discrimination based on differences. We need to perhaps develop anti-Islamophobic educational programs for schools, workplaces, and public spaces. And this is not as prevalent, I think, in Cape Town as perhaps in other provinces. And we need to counter misinformation by amplifying Muslim voices through the media, storytelling, and community forums. Advocates and activists can push for stronger hate crime legislation that explicitly addresses Islamophobic violence and advocate for anti-discrimination policies in workplaces and institutions to protect Muslim professionals and students. Mainstream media can challenge negative portrayals of Muslims by promoting inclusive storytelling. Education programs can help people recognize and reject Islamophobic rhetoric. We can support Muslim-led organizations that focus on justice, equality, and social change, and mobilize communities to document and to report Islamophobic incidents, which will thus ensure accountability. We need to address the psychological impact of Islamophobia, reinforcing cultural identity and empowerment.
Now, if I recall correctly, your research thesis was on the mental health of lesbian Muslims, which is quite a niche group, especially if we're talking about openly gay Muslim women. Can you tell us a bit about your research and about the queer Muslim community in Cape Town?
So many religious women who don't conform to traditional gender roles or sexual norms face significant stress. And this is across religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, often seen as patriarchal and homophobic. So the experiences of Muslim lesbian women are particularly complex and largely invisible. So because of the stigma surrounding their identities, many Muslim lesbians in Cape Town, ironically in a city often regarded as the gay capital of South Africa, navigate their lives in secrecy. So while broader studies on the LGBTIQ plus Muslim community internationally highlight the challenges of balancing religious faith with sexual identity, there was very little research on the specific psychosocial difficulties Muslim lesbians face in Cape Town at the time that I did my research. I'm hoping that much more research has been done subsequently. We're talking about 8-9 years ago. So my research aimed to change that, knowing that it was probably just going to go sit on a shelf because it was an honors level research. But I'm a hopeless person, not hopeless, hopeful person. And yeah, maybe some people would say I'm a hopeless case because I always remain hopeful. So I used a qualitative, now let me see if I can pronounce this word right, phenomenological approach, that I wanted to give voice to Muslim lesbians and understand their unique stresses. So the study was guided by the minority stress model, which explores coping mechanisms, barriers to coping, sources of social support, and patterns of help seeking. I conducted in-depth face-to-face interviews with six participants. I mean, that's such a small sample. So sometimes I do feel that because it was such a small sample, how much of voice and credence did my research hold? Okay. But beyond contributing to academic knowledge, I would have helped to reduce stigma, encourage culturally sensitive advocacy, and build bridges between Muslim lesbians and society at large. And it certainly impacted me in that way. As the researcher, it certainly got me to understand the Muslim lesbian community on a whole different level. And I hope the same for other people. So lesbian Muslims often navigate intersecting layers of marginalization, facing discrimination both within religious spaces and the LGBTIQ plus communities. And some of the key findings from my research included religious stigma, where many struggle with reconciling their faith and sexuality, particularly in conservative Muslim communities. There's a lot of family and social pressures, and many of these women feared rejection or were forced into secrecy and therefore led lives isolated lives, very anxious, highly anxious and stressed. And that often led to depression. There were limited mental health resources for Muslim communities because of the fear of disclosure. And very few therapists actually specialize in affirming both queer and Muslim identities, making access to cultural competent care difficult. I'm talking particularly about Muslim therapists and counselors here. So many Muslim lesbians have coped by connecting with like-minded people and allies, pursuing their faith privately and outside of mainstream structural spaces, not disclosing to their family as it felt safer, whilst those whose families knew don't make a big issue of it. So it's kept secret. It's not spoken about. It's not embraced openly. Some coped friendly clubs and using alcohol. So unfortunately, my research did not comment on the intersecting struggles of Islamophobia and homophobia. And it would have really been nice if I had the time, but I was limited. An honest student, not doing PhD, not doing masters. So it was limiting.
But I guess one of the challenges in working with kids is that they are even more influenced by the systems that they move in and the other people in their lives than adults are. So it's super important to involve the caregivers in the work that we do with the kids so that they can also support a child's healing at home between sessions. How would you advise parents, grandparents, and other caregivers to support the mental health of their children and help them to heal from trauma?
I would recommend a few things. And I feel that probably a lot of you are already doing this already. So if this only just builds on that, then that's amazing. So providing that safe, stable environment and routine as far as humanly possible, and having conversations with your child about safety and what that means in the environment is so important for them to understand and to navigate their space better. And just also actively listening, and being emotionally available when your child says something, don't emotionally check out and go, oh, they're blaming me for X, Y, Z. So also looking at it from a non-judgmental space and just really allowing them to vent and to share their views. And if they ask you for how to manage this, then offer, but try not to insert yourself too much into the context. So a great way to do this is by using open-ended questions instead of closing statements to their responses. So validating their feelings and not dismissing them. So for example, not going, oh, but XYZ's child isn't like this, or they don't do this, so what's going on here? So really understanding that everyone is unique, everyone is on their own journey, and that your child may need they may need to have their own views and visions for their future respected. And to find out how to do that in a sensitive way is really important and significant, whether, it's making jokes, if that's your language with your child, and that's also important. And then just looking out for any significant changes in behavior is a really big aspect. For example, especially with young children, things like biting, bedwetting, those sort of aspects are really important to look into understanding what is going on, because as I mentioned earlier, there's such a big relationship between, even as you mentioned, the mind and the body, and that they're always connected, so the one will always have an interplay on the other. And then this one may be a bit tricky, especially when it comes to use of language around children, but being a role model for healthy coping skills. So that is such a big aspect. So instead of, flicking or swearing when you face a difficult situation, changing your language to go, well, what can I do to really improve the situation? And to sort of soften that, that initial tumble down on the hamster wheel that we all tend to fall on. So being that role model for healthy coping skills, and then seeking professional help if you need it, letting your child know that it's okay to see someone for help. And that if this is what they need, then we need to go to the right people for the right things. If we go to the doctor because, we're sick, or we go to a surgeon because we've broken our leg or something significant, then we need to know who to go to and how to get help. And then also empowering them and avoiding that re-traumatization, as I mentioned earlier. And really that requires sort of something that I mentioned earlier, which is the active listening and being emotionally available. And then the big one, which I know I'm going to get a lot of ahs and oh no about, is take care of yourself. And I know many adults who are listening to this are going, we always neglect that self-care. Self-care is such a buzzword. What is that? But really taking care of yourself, making sure that you're eating enough, you're getting enough sleep, and that you're actually able to be there for yourself, for your family, and for your work in a healthy and productive way is so essential.
You and I have also connected about our support for Palestine and our activism against the ongoing genocide in Gaza. South Africa was the first country to bring a case of genocide against Israel to the International Court of Justice. This case was obviously justified, and South Africa did the right thing. But why do you think South Africa, of all the countries in the world, feels so strongly about the plight of the Palestinians?
Yeah, so I was just thinking that, as I was just thinking about this question, and I wonder why so many years after 1994, I still have to answer some of these questions. But let me tell you, and let me try and explain, that South Africa's strong support for Palestine is deeply rooted in our own history of colonization, apartheid, and resistance. Our country sees parallels between our struggles against racial segregation, discrimination, and the Palestinian fight against occupation, making solidarity such a natural extension of our own commitment to justice. The African National Congress and the Palestinian Liberation Organization have had ties since the anti-colonial movements of the 50s and the 60s. Nelson Mandela, our late president, famously stated, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." And many South Africans view Israel's policies towards Palestinians as similar to apartheid, particularly in terms of land disposition, restricted movement, and systemic discrimination. South Africa's post-apartheid government has consistently prioritized human rights and anti-colonial struggles, making Palestine a key issue in its international stance. Bringing the case to the ICJ has influenced global discussions on human rights and international law. If South Africa hadn't done this, I personally would have been extremely disappointed as a person who voted for this government. The success of the anti-apartheid boycott has made South Africa a model for global pro-Palestinian activism.
Some people might say that apartheid has been over for 30 years, and with the advent of cell phones, the internet, and globalization, children across South Africa and around the world are growing up with a more monolithic culture, a common set of references and values and interests. How would you respond to that?
Honestly, this really reminds me of this powerful speech that was delivered by Charlie Chaplin all the way back in 1940, which is 80 years ago? I wonder if we can't play it.
You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world, a decent world, that will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world, to do away with national barriers, to do away with greed, with hate and intolerance. Let us fight for a world of reason, a world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!
So in this Charlie Chaplin speech, at that time, technology wasn't where it is today. And yet, if we consider what they were facing at the time, I feel that as human beings, we are still looking for freedom. We're still looking for what democracy really promised, which was this ability to be free thinking and to not be persecuted for, freedom of speech. And so while the formal system of apartheid may be behind us, the world continues to grapple with issues like greedy leadership, systemic social discrimination on just any aspect of our stratification, whether that's race, gender, any sort of part of that class even. So those imbalanced power structures that manifest in ways that are unique to our time, it's absolutely insane. So these challenges really highlight how far we still have to go in terms of upholding basic human values. I think throughout time, we seem to really not quite have it down in terms of how do we respect everyone and give them equally human dignity and respect that. And as a community, as a government, on an individual basis, how can we be more respectful to those aspects? So I strongly believe that every individual is entitled to dignity, respect, and equal opportunity. And if we can come together, whether we create a culture or as a community around those shared values, collective interests, and a common respect for humanity and the planet, then perhaps we can do more to build a sustainable future and to just respect our space. So I feel that unity doesn't necessarily require uniformity. It requires empathy, understanding, and a willingness to challenge systems that prioritize profits or control over people on the planet, which sadly is really reflected in today's climate. And furthermore, I feel that education plays a vital role in this transformation. So teaching children and teenagers, and even just young adults, that ability to have that discernment, to have those critical thinking skills in schools is so essential, so that young people can develop the ability to question, to analyze and make informed decisions about what's going on around them, rather than becoming, sort of passive recipient for biased information and propaganda. Because as you can see with the way social media has changed over time, it seems like we're being swayed either way in the face of distraction. So only by empowering the next generation to think for themselves can we hope to foster a society built on truth, justice, and compassion is, honestly, I feel, the best way forward.
What are some of the trauma-informed approaches to self-care that you recommend for listeners to manage their own mental health so that they can put on their own oxygen masks first?
Absolutely. So to preface everything that I'm saying for this segment is that mental health and practicing good mental health habits is not something that you'll find in 1 or 2 sessions or a few sessions. It's got to be something that you're practicing constantly, whether you're going for therapy or counseling or just you're on a self-help journey. So being gentle on yourself and finding out what your safe space is as an adult. A lot of the times adults are going back to habits and spaces that may have served them well as children, but as adults no longer serve them anymore. So understanding as an adult, what is your safe space? Who are your safe people? And surrounding yourself with a supportive network to really insulate you from life's hardships. So if you think of yourself as sort of a wire insulated by a cable, it's that, sometimes you're going through something, sometimes your environment is going through something, and you need to have your people to really just insulate you. So finding that good support system, and maybe even exploring that if you haven't found that yet, Sometimes you have to go through also a process of decluttering if you feel like that's what you need at this point in your life. So finding that tool or technique that works for you to manage stress doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional approach. You could be creative about it, whether that's having 10 minutes of silence in the morning before you go to work, or that cup of coffee before you get out of the car. Finding that thing that really helps you manage your stress. And then boundaries and practicing non-judgmentalism, which is also a really big aspect, I would say, for listeners to work through. Because a lot of the time with boundaries, it's so hard to really keep them up. The minute we put one up, you immediately get pushback. People around you are like, why do I have to do this? Why do I have to conform to that? Why must I do this all of a sudden? And accepting that it's okay for them to push back, but your role is to reinforce your own boundaries, not to explain away or, to try and validate sometimes that little inner voice in your head that makes you feel guilt about putting up that boundary. So that's a big part of it. And that all stems from having a really good sense of non-judgmentalism. And then seek professional help when you're ready for it or when you need it. And really know that the professionals out there are really here for you and are ready to offer you that safe and non-judgmental space. They really are there to offer you that unconditional positive regard and authenticity, and they want to help you on your authentic journey is a big aspect.
Yes, I think we as adults also need good role models. And sometimes having someone in your life set a boundary can remind you that it's also good and healthy for you to set boundaries. Thank you for listening to Intersectional Psychology. Please follow or subscribe to the podcast to get every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review Intersectional Psychology in your preferred app. It really helps other people find the podcast. This episode of Intersectional Psychology was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Aurora Brown. For a transcript of this episode, please see the link in the show notes on your podcast app or go to intersectionalpsychology.com. You can also check the website or the show notes for a full list of references for this episode. A video of this episode with closed captions is available on youtube.com/@intersectional psychology. To support this podcast and get access to bonus content, including additional episodes and interviews, as well as more guided mindfulness sessions, please go to patreon.com/intersectional psychology. You can also chat with me on Blue Sky at intersectpsych.bsky.social and Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at Intersectional Psychology. But mostly Blue Sky. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology are committed to the Cite Black Women praxis. All episodes of Intersectional Psychology are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I, Aurora Brown, am not able to answer specific questions about individual situations. Always seek the advice of your health provider with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this podcast. If you think you need immediate assistance, please call your local emergency number or any mental health crisis hotline. Everyone deserves good mental health.